The trust responsibility, a holistic examination of its foundations and purpose. The trust responsibility of the United States to indigenous peoples is a multifaceted, enduring, and legally complex obligation, deeply rooted in a tapestry of treaties, statutes, executive orders, and historical agreements. It mandates ongoing commitments, including substantial financial disbursements, the provision of essential services such as healthcare and EduCat-ION, and the implementation of robust protections for tribal sovereignty, lands, and cultural resources. These obligations, some of which demonstrably predate the U.S. Constitution and the very founding of the nation, raise complex and often contentious questions about their constitutionality, ethical foundations, and practical implications, particularly given their perpetual nature, the substantial financial scale often quantified as billions upon billions of dollars, and their enduring impact on future generations, including descendants of individuals who were not citizens when these agreements were forged. This comprehensive response aims to meticulously address these multifaceted concerns by thoroughly exploring the historical impetus behind indigenous concessions, unequivocally affirming that the trust responsibility is an indispensable obligation grounded in fundamental standards of just treatment and the imperative to remediate profound historical injustices, and encapsulating the full depth and breadth of what is being addressed through this enduring commitment, ensuring a nuanced understanding of its significance. Impetus for indigenous concessions, a study in coercion and survival, pre- and post-revolution, the concessions made by indigenous peoples, primarily the relinquishment of vast territories, natural resources, and inherent rights to self-determination, were not voluntary transactions reflecting mutual agreement, but rather the tragic outcomes of complex and often profoundly unjust circumstances, driven by overwhelming external pressures exerted by colonial and later U.S. governments. A thorough and historically accurate understanding of this coercive impetus is essential to fully appreciate the purpose, necessity, and ethical weight of the trust responsibility. Coercion and military pressure, the instrument of domination across eras, indigenous nations were frequently compelled to cede land and resources under duress. Facing the constant threat or direct application of military force, the U.S. government, leveraging its military superiority and the relentless expansion of settler populations, employed force or the ever-present threat of force to extract agreements, a pattern that began well before the nation's founding. For instance, the Treaty of New Eshota 1835, which resulted in the infamous Trail of Tears, exemplifies this coercive dynamic, where the Cherokee were forcibly removed from their ancestral homeland despite their determined resistance, illustrating how military pressure served as the bedrock of numerous concessions. Even prior to the establishment of the United States, colonial powers used similar tactics, systematically employing military force to compel indigenous nations to relinquish their territories. Pre-1770 examples include Treaty of Middle Plantation 1677, an early agreement between the colony of Virginia and several indigenous tribes, which established a form of protectorate and set precedents for future land cessions under duress, marking the beginning of a pattern of forced agreements. Treaty of Albany 1722, aimed at establishing peace and trade relations between the colony of New York and the Iroquois Confederacy, but also served as a tool for asserting colonial control, demonstrating the dual purpose of these agreements. Treaty of Easton 1758. During the French and Indian War, this treaty involved promises of land and protection in exchange for indigenous neutrality, promises that were frequently broken after the conflict, highlighting the unreliability of colonial promises. The Covenant Chain Agreements, 1677 onward, a series of agreements between the Iroquois Confederacy and the English colonies which evolved over time, consistently demonstrating the use of diplomatic and military pressure, and illustrating the evolving nature of colonial control. Treaty with the Delaware 1701, William Penn's agreements with the Delaware tribes, while initially viewed as fair, set the stage for later land disputes and forced removals, demonstrating the long-term consequences of these agreements. Treaty of Lancaster 1744, further land cessions from the Iroquois to the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, highlighting the relentless pressure for land acquisition. Treaty of Logstown 1752, land grants and agreements between the Ohio Company and various Native American tribes, which directly led to conflict, illustrating how these agreements often sowed the seeds of future conflict. These treaties, along with many others, illustrate a consistent pattern of using military and political pressure to force indigenous nations into agreements that were detrimental to their interests. Unequal negotiations, a paradigm of disparity enduring through centuries, treaties were consistently negotiated under profoundly unequal terms, reflecting a stark power imbalance that persisted throughout colonial and U.S. history. Indigenous leaders, lacking comparable political or economic leverage, found themselves facing U.S. representatives who dictated terms in English, a language many did not fully comprehend. The reliance on translators, who were sometimes unreliable or intentionally biased, further exacerbated this disparity, leading to agreements that fundamentally misrepresented indigenous intent and understanding. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, which initially promised the Lakota Sioux a vast reservation, only to be subsequently violated following the discovery of gold, underscores the profound imbalance in bargaining power. This power imbalance was also evident in pre-revolutionary agreements, where colonial officials often imposed terms without meaningful negotiation, demonstrating the continuity of this pattern. Deception and broken promises, the erosion of trust across generations. In numerous instances, the U.S. government resorted to deception to secure concessions, a pattern that began in the colonial era and continued throughout U.S. history. Promises of protection, annuities, or reserved lands were made to induce agreement, only to be systematically ignored or undermined later. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek 1830, with the Choctaw which promised financial support and land west of the Mississippi, stands as a poignant example of this pattern of betrayal. The subsequent delays and inadequate fulfillment of these promises left the Choctaw impoverished and displaced, shattering their trust in the U.S. government. This pattern of broken promises extends back to colonial agreements, where promises of protection were frequently broken as settler expansion continued, highlighting the enduring nature of this breach of trust. Survival amid crisis. The pragmatism of desperation in the face of extinction, for many indigenous nations making concessions, was a desperate strategy to ensure their very survival in the face of relentless pressure. The relentless encroachment by settlers, the devastating impact of European introduced diseases such as smallpox, and the depletion of traditional resources like buffalo left tribes with virtually no viable alternatives. Agreements offering healthcare, education, or reserved lands were perceived as critical lifelines, essential to preserving their people and culture against existential threats. The impetus was not a voluntary exchange, but a pragmatic, albeit tragic, response to the relentless advance of colonization. This dynamic was present even before the United States existed, as tribes faced similar pressures from European colonial powers, demonstrating the long-standing nature of this existential threat. Loss of sovereignty and autonomy, the price of coexistence under duress, beyond the loss of land and resources. Concessions often involve the surrender of crucial aspects of sovereignty, such as jurisdiction over trade or governance, in exchange for federal protection. This was not a willing trade, but a forced adaptation to a new reality where indigenous autonomy was systematically eroded, marking a profound shift in the balance of power. This loss of sovereignty began during the colonial era, as European powers asserted control over indigenous territories and affairs, and continued throughout U.S. history, demonstrating the persistent erosion of tribal self-determination. In summary, the impetus for these concessions was a desperate struggle for survival amid overwhelming coercion, pervasive deceit, and existential threats, rather than a fair or mutually beneficial exchange. The trust responsibility emerges from this historical context as a critical mechanism to acknowledge and rectify these profound injustices and to honor the commitments made to indigenous nations under such duress, many of which were initiated long before the United States was formed, highlighting the inherited nature of these obligations. Constitutional foundations, the legal framework of obligation and continuity. The trust responsibility is firmly rooted in the U.S. Constitution, providing a robust and enduring legal foundation for its ongoing obligations, ensuring that these commitments are not merely historical relics but legally binding responsibilities. Treaties as supreme law, the cornerstone of federal Indian law and national inheritance. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution unequivocally declares that all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. This one provision extends to treaties with indigenous nations, regardless of whether they predate the Constitution, e.g., the Treaty of Fort Pitt 1778, or were enacted subsequently, ensuring that these agreements are legally binding and enforceable. The federal government's assumption of pre-existing agreements and its explicit authority to enter into new ones ensures their binding nature across generations, establishing a legal continuum of obligation that extends from the colonial era to the present day. Importantly, the Treaty of Fort Pitt, made in 1778, predates the ratification of the Constitution, demonstrating that the United States inherited these treaty obligations, underscoring the continuity of these responsibilities. Congressional power, the legislative mandate and enduring authority, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, empowers Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. This three clause not only recognizes indigenous tribes as distinct political entities with inherent sovereignty, but also explicitly authorizes Congress to uphold treaty commitments, including those involving perpetual financial absolutely. Let's continue extending the response, building on the congressional power section and moving forward. Congressional power, the legislative mandate and enduring authority continued. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution empowers Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. This clause not only recognizes indigenous tribes as distinct political entities with inherent sovereignty, but also explicitly authorizes Congress to uphold treaty commitments, including those involving perpetual financial or protective obligations. This legislative mandate ensures that the trust responsibility is not merely a matter of executive discretion, but a fundamental duty enshrined in the Constitution and subject to congressional oversight. Furthermore, Congress has repeatedly enacted legislation affirming and implementing the trust responsibility, demonstrating its ongoing commitment to these obligations. This includes laws that provide for the delivery of essential services, the protection of tribal lands and resources, and the recognition of tribal sovereignty. The enduring nature of this congressional authority underscores the long-term commitment of the U.S. government to fulfilling its trust obligations. Judicial reinforcement, the guardians of legal continuity and fiduciary duty. The Supreme Court has consistently affirmed the trust responsibility, solidifying its legal standing and providing crucial interpretations that have shaped its implementation. In landmark cases such as Cherokee Nation v. Georgia 1831 and Worcester v. Georgia 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall famously characterized tribes as domestic dependent nations under federal guardianship, thereby cementing the government's enduring duty to protect them. These decisions established the foundational principles of federal Indian law, including the recognition of tribal sovereignty and the fiduciary duty of the U.S. government. Later cases, such as Morton v. Minkari 1974, have further upheld this fiduciary relationship, ensuring its legal continuity and reinforcing its binding nature. The judiciary's role in interpreting and enforcing the trust responsibility has been essential in ensuring that these obligations are not merely abstract principles but concrete legal duties. The courts have consistently held that the federal government has a legal and ethical obligation to act in the best interests of indigenous nations, providing a critical check on executive and legislative actions. Thus, the trust responsibility is demonstrably constitutionally valid, binding future generations through the enduring authority of treaties and Congress's explicit powers as consistently upheld by the judiciary, and importantly, through the inheritance of pre-existing agreements and the establishment of a robust legal framework that ensures its continuity and enforceability. The relationship between the colonial governments, the subsequent United States government, and the millions of enslaved infant Africans and their descendants was not merely one of ownership, but a pervasive and enduring paternalistic state. This paternalism, rooted in the legal framework of chattel slavery, extended beyond individual slaveholders to encompass the entire societal and governmental structure, and was deeply intertwined with religious justifications. Inherited paternalism and religious justification. This paternalistic state was inherited from the colonial era, where the monarchy and its representatives established and enforced laws that codified the ownership of human beings. The American founders, and the colonial governments before them, overwhelmingly characterized themselves as followers of Jesus and Christians. They frequently used biblical interpretations to justify the enslavement of Africans, portraying it as a divinely ordained social order. The United States, upon its formation, adopted and perpetuated these laws and these religious justifications, thereby inheriting the paternalistic obligations and responsibilities associated with them. This encumbrance is on all who inherit the power, property, and sovereignty of the predecessors of the United States. State-sanctioned control, primarily over infant Africans and their descendants, reinforced by religious doctrine. The government, through its legislative, executive, and judicial branches, actively participated in maintaining this paternalistic system. Laws were enacted to regulate every aspect of enslaved people's lives, beginning from birth, reinforcing the state's control. Crucially, the domestic slave trade and the birth of approximately 9.5 million infant Africans into the system highlights the extreme level of state-sanctioned control from the very start of life. The infant status of the overwhelming majority, well over 90% of Africans within the system from 1526 through 1970, underscores the profound vulnerability and the systematic denial of their inherent humanity. It was primarily infants that were born into and lived within this system, and their descendants who inherited the results of this system. Religious doctrines were used to reinforce this control, with interpretations of scripture used to assert the inferiority of Africans and their supposed suitability for enslavement. Beyond individual ownership sanctioned by religious beliefs, while individual slaveholders exercised direct control, the state provided the legal and social framework that made this control possible. This framework created a collective responsibility, extending beyond individual slaveholders to all who benefited from the system, including those who inherited the power and sovereignty of the nation. Religious beliefs played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and justifying the system of slavery, creating a societal acceptance of this paternalistic control. A deeper and perpetual obligation, compounded by religious hypocrisy, the paternalistic nature of this relationship, characterized by the state's active role in controlling the lives and bodies of enslaved infant Africans and their descendants, especially from infancy, creates a far deeper and inherently perpetual obligation than the guardianship relationship articulated by the courts in the 1800s. Specifically, in Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, 1831, and Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall established the concept of domestic dependent nations, characterizing the relationship between the United States and Native American tribes as one of guardianship or protection. However, the control exerted over the reproduction and the very beginning of the lives of human beings, and the inheritance of that state of control, compounded by the hypocrisy of using Christian beliefs to justify such inhumane treatment, creates an unending duty. The sheer scale of the harm, the duration of the system, and the intergenerational impact of slavery demand a comprehensive and sustained response that must be seen as perpetual. Because of the control exerted over the creation of life, the obligation is more akin to a debt that is owed to the entirety of the descendants. Therefore, the relationship was not simply one of ownership, but a complex and deeply ingrained paternalistic state interwoven with religious justifications that placed a profound and enduring, indeed perpetual, obligation on the United States and its predecessors, with a specific and critical focus on the vulnerability inherent in the infant status of the vast majority of those subjected to this system and their descendants.